The invasion will be their grave. We will throw them back into the sea within hours. Those were the words the Germans wrote in their letters and whispered in their concrete bunkers before the sun rose on that June 6, 1944. They looked down at us from the slits of WN-62 on Omaha Beach and laughed. To them, we were just boys from weak and divided democracies, coming to die on a beach that Field Marshal Rommel had promised to turn into a cemetery. They had 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel protecting them. What they called the Atlantic Wall, an impregnable line stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. They were so confident that many veteran officers even took the day off to celebrate birthdays or participate in war games far from the coast, believing the terrible weather would keep us cowering at sea. I was in that landing craft smelling vomit, diesel oil, and salt water. Fear wasn't something abstract. It was a physical weight crushing my lungs. I looked at the guy next to me, a kid from Kentucky who barely had a beard, gripping his rifle like it was the only solid thing in a world about to explode. The Germans had every reason to mock us if you looked only at the cold numbers. They had 8 concrete bunkers, 35 machine gun nests, and 18 anti-tank gun positions pointed directly at our heads on that single beach. They planted 3,700 obstacles in the tidal zone and hid 6.5 million mines under the sand. When the ramp of our Higgins boat dropped, their laughter turned into the sound of ripping linoleum. The MG-42, firing 200 rounds per minute. The first wave was a massacre. I saw men cut in half before they even touched the water. The sergeant was shouting, but the sound was drowned out by explosions. What the Germans didn't understand while they fired their 13,500 rounds of ammunition was that every American there carried something concrete could not stop. It wasn't just poster boy patriotism, it was a quiet trust in one another. I remember seeing an engineer covered in sand and blood crawling to blow up one of the steel Czech hedgehogs so we could advance. He didn't hesitate. He knew that if he failed, the rest of us would die. That was our sovereignty. It didn't come from rigid orders from Berlin, but from our ability to look at chaos and decide we weren't going to stop. We were terrified, yes, but fear turned into brutal adaptation. When we realized the battle plans had gone to hell and communications were cut, we didn't freeze like the German commanders who waited for Hitler's orders to move their tanks. We started climbing those bluffs. I remember looking back and seeing the Armada, 6,939 vessels covering the horizon like a gray carpet. At that moment, their silence began. They saw we were not the weak force their propaganda had promised. We were the whole world arriving at their doorstep, and the cemetery Rommel planned was beginning to receive the wrong occupants. Their laughter died completely when the USS Texas began to speak. I felt the vibration of the 14-inch shells in my chest, even from hundreds of meters away. Those bunkers they thought eternal began to crack like sandcastles under the weight of thousands of tons of explosives. The German defenders began to suffer what historians would later call material shock, a mental collapse caused by facing a force so overwhelming that the mind simply refuses to process what the eyes see. They had planned their defense based on ammunition calculations for 3 days of battle, but they ran out in hours because we simply did not stop coming. American logistics were a beautiful and terrible thing to witness. While the Germans tried to bring reinforcements by horse or marching along roads under constant air attack, we were building entire artificial ports on the sand. I saw ships unloading whole armored regiments in a matter of hours. American sovereignty wasn't just in the courage of the soldier with a bayonet, but in those factories in Detroit that produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The Germans underestimated us as merchants, and now we were manufacturing victory on an industrial assembly line they couldn't even comprehend. I remember a German prisoner we captured near a destroyed artillery battery. He looked like a ghost, covered in concrete dust. He looked at us with a mixture of hatred and total disbelief. They had been taught they were the superior race, the elite warriors, but there we were. A mechanic from Ohio, a farmer from Kansas, and a delivery boy from Brooklyn, operating a war machine that made the invincible Wehrmacht look obsolete. They had dreams of glory and horses. We had tractors, jeeps, and firepower that did not respect the past. The tension was constant. Even as we advanced, the human cost was visible in every meter of ground taken. I saw Sherman tanks destroyed by German Tigers, but for every tank we lost, 2 new ones appeared on the horizon. It was cruel mathematics. Their tank aces could be brilliant, destroying 14 of our vehicles in 15 minutes, but at the end of the day, their losses were irreplaceable, while ours were just production statistics. That was the harshest lesson they learned. The age of individual warrior heroes was over. War now belonged to the society that could produce more and apply that production more efficiently. And we were the masters of that new era. When we finally broke the encirclement in Operation Cobra, the scale of destruction was apocalyptic. The sky went dark with more than 1,500 heavy bombers dropping 4,000 tons of bombs in a tiny area. German generals wrote in their diaries that their men were no longer soldiers, but broken men, psychologically destroyed by what they called industrial supremacy. The Falaise Pocket became a cemetery of dead horses, burned-out vehicles, and shattered illusions. They had promised to throw us into the sea, but ended up being swept away by a tide they could not stop, leaving behind 320,000 casualties in just 2 months. Victory existed, yes. We liberated cities, crossed France, and broke the spine of what they called a 1,000-year Reich. But when I look back, I don't see maps or medals. I see the faces of the friends who stayed on those beaches. The price was far too high, written in the 2,400 names of those who fell on Omaha alone that first day. American sovereignty was forged in the sacrifice of young men who had their entire lives ahead of them, and who chose, in a moment of absolute terror, not to take a step back. We proved that a free democracy could overcome the fanaticism of a dictatorship, but we paid for that proof with the blood of a generation. Today, when I hear someone talk about war as if it were a numbers game or a history lesson, I feel a sting of bitterness. It wasn't a lesson. It was an industrial meat grinder that swallowed dreams and spat out trauma. The Germans began that day laughing at us, confident in their steel and concrete, and ended up witnessing the arsenal of democracy at its most terrifying efficiency. They learned that courage, without the capacity to produce and sustain, is only a tragic way to die. I survived, but part of me is still in that landing craft, waiting for the ramp to fall. If you are reading this, don't you dare forget what was paid. Don't treat our freedom as something guaranteed or as a cheap political slogan. Those boys who were mocked and underestimated gave everything so the world would not become one giant concrete bunker. Honor their sacrifice not with words, but by living in a way that makes that cost worth it. What we did there was transform industry into liberation, but never forget that every bolt in those victory machines was baptized with the tears of someone who never came home.